My name is Lee Baumann. I am speaking on the spiritual and supernatural elements of quantum physics for the non-scientist, light's consciousness. Physicists long ago discovered the characteristics of light to be similar to previous descriptions that we had always reserved for God. These characteristics included what I call the three omnis, that is, omnipresence, or being everywhere, omniscience, or being all-knowing, and omnipotence, or being all-powerful. The fourth major characteristic is one that physicists have ascribed to light using the term conscious. This is a term applied by physicists and not by Lee Baumann. Back in the 1930s, Albert Einstein, together with two colleagues, Boris Podolsky and Nathan Rosen, improvised a thought experiment which has subsequently become known as the EPR experiment. This experiment was contrived by these three friends in an effort to refute an element of quantum physics that Einstein in particular did not like. This characteristic is known by the term non-locality, which means that quantum mechanics appears to have an attribute linking the entire cosmos instantaneously. Einstein never liked this characteristic and spent a good period of his life trying to disprove it. The actual experiment which substantiated quantum mechanics' attribute of non-locality did not take place until several decades later. In the meantime, however, John Bell, a mathematician, came up with a theorem which basically proved quantum mechanics' attribute of non-locality in 1964. In the EPR experiment, two photons are released by an energized atom, and they travel in opposite directions out into the universe. What is found through the actual EPR experiment is that when the attributes of one photon are identified, it immediately identifies the same attributes in the photon traveling off into the cosmos in the exact opposite direction. The ramifications of the experiment are far-reaching. The experiment basically identifies that information, communication, and knowledge may occur instantaneously between two distant points in the universe. That is not to say that waves or particles can travel faster than the speed of light. This latter supposition is felt not to be possible. However, the EPR experiment appears to prove that information or communication can and does occur instantaneously across our universe. Although this experiment may not immediately bring to mind the conscious behavior of light, over the next few slides this attribute will become clearer. There are a host and series of experiments which appear to display aspects of light's conscious behavior. The double-slit experiment was the classic experiment which first identified this trait with light and other wave particles. The quantum eraser experiment is an offshoot of the double-slit experiment, but has developed its own series of experiments as a result. The double-slit experiment is more complex than the quantum eraser experiment, and for that reason I will focus on the quantum eraser experiment. What these experiments appear to show is that light alters its behavior based upon an incredible awareness of its surroundings, sounding almost like a human trait. The experimental results were so profound that it led Nobel Prize winners, including Richard Feynman, to make the following comment. The experiment reveals, quote, a phenomenon which is impossible, absolutely impossible to explain in any classical way, end quote. Here is a simplified version of one setup of the quantum eraser experiment. The flashlight depicts an apparatus which releases a single photon into the experimental setup. The photon passes through a crystal which has the unique properties of being able to split even a single photon into two half photons. One half photon labeled B goes into the upper aspect of the experimental setup and is reflected by a mirror and is directed toward a beam splitter. The lower half photon A is also reflected off of a mirror and meets its companion at the site of the beam splitter. In this particular setup of the experiment, we see how the two half photons meet in the area of the beam splitter and continue on their independent paths and are subsequently detected as shown by both photon detectors number 1 and number 2 in the diagram. In this modification of the same experiment, the entire experimental setup remains the same for the exception of the placement of two polarized panes of glass placed in front of each of the two photon detectors number 1 and number 2. It does not take a rocket scientist to make the determination that a change at the very end of this or any experiment should alter the outcome of the photons' paths in the middle of the experiment. And yet, this is exactly what happens. Instead of continuing on their independent paths, one half photon going to detector number 1 and the other half photon going on to detector number 2, both photons now meet and continue in parallel from the beam splitter to detector number 2. What this experiment so well demonstrates is that time does not exist for the mysterious photon. Einstein first showed us in his special theory of relativity that photons exist outside of time. Put another way, he showed that time does not exist for the photon. In the quantum eraser experiment, we see how the photons literally detected the changes at the end of the experiment, went back in time to the middle of the experiment, and altered their behavior. We cannot explain why the photons act in mysterious ways that they do. All we can do is observe their behavior. Niels Bohr, Danish physicist and Nobel Prize winner, perhaps summed the photon's behavior best when he noted those who are not shocked when they first come across quantum theory cannot possibly have understood it. Thank you.